The following program is a public access production of the Cayuga Museum of History and Art and Case Research Lab, who assumes full responsibility for its content. The content of this program does not represent the views of Auburn Regional Media Access, which serves as a forum for community expression and offers TV training, production facilities, and channel time to all Auburn area residents and organizations.
Thank you, Kirsten, and the staff of the Cayuga Museum. I'm really thrilled to be here. It's not in my bio, but I also worked for Kirsten for a time when I was looking for a career in the museum field, and it feels really great to be home. And I know some of you in the audience, and thank you for coming and supporting the Cayuga Museum. So I know that we have some Emily Holland fans here in the audience. I do want to let you know she is not included in my presentation, but that doesn't mean that I don't recognize her contribution to the women's movement, to access to education. I've been doing a lot of research about Susan B. Anthony and Martha Coffin Wright and Harriet Tubman. So those are the two women that I'm going to focus on from Cayuga County, but don't worry, we know Emily Holland. We know that she is one of the leading donors to the women's movement here in New York State and certainly deserves more recognition than she gets. So I do want to start off just by saying that. So for those of you that aren't as familiar with Susan B. Anthony, I just wanted to start off by giving you a little introduction to some of the causes that she cared about. Some of them I'm going to touch on tonight. Some of them, if you have questions about them at the end, I would be more than happy to respond to those. But Susan B. Anthony is best known for caring about getting the right to vote for women, but she cared about a lot more than just that. The 19th and early 20th century for me is a time of incredible change. You see this country go from being a largely agrarian society to this industrial society. Susan B. Anthony is alive for 86 years of that, so she's seeing tremendous amounts of change, not only in how transportation exists, but politically and socially as well. And so some of the things that she cared about and was heavily involved in were temperance and abolition, women's rights, bodily autonomy. She said in the 1850s that every person, it is a basic human right to make decisions about your own person. And access to education is one of the things that she cared about from the start. Susan B. Anthony loved school, and she had a very progressive father, Daniel, who was looking for equal education opportunities for all of his children. That included his daughters, not just his sons. And Susan B. Anthony's favorite subject was math. And one day her teacher announced that they were getting ready to learn advanced mathematics, and she couldn't wait, but is absolutely devastated when he sends all of the girls home from school. There's no need for them to stay and learn. And by advanced mathematics, we're talking long division at that time. So there's lots more that she could have learned at that point, but she'll go home and tell her father what happened. And he's going to do something that I believe is really transformative in her life. He'll pull all of his children from school, hire his own teacher, and say, no subjects off limits to my children. You teach them whatever they want to learn. So what she learned that day is when you see something that's not fair, you change it. And that's going to carry with her throughout the rest of her life. Pay equity is another thing that she learns about pretty early on. I truly believe her activism started in her teens. She'll start teaching at the age of 15. And as a woman teaching, she is paid $2 a week. Male teachers are making $10 to $15 a week for doing the same job. So you can only imagine how she felt about her pay. So she'll start traveling around to education conventions, demanding women be paid the same as men. And she's not going to win this battle. She is going to not only have the men in the room, but the women in the room tell her to sit down and be quiet as well. And she will reach the highest levels of the teaching profession. She'll be the headmistress of a girls' school, and she'll make 4 times less than what a man was making in the same role. So she'll leave teaching, and by that time, her family will have left Battenville, New York. They originally moved from Adams, Massachusetts to Battenville, New York. They're hit by the Panic of 1837. Daniel loses their house, loses his job at the textile mill, and they'll travel along the Erie Canal and they'll settle in Rochester, New York. And the house that you see on the screen will be the first home that the Anthonys live in. It's located near where the Rochester Airport is located today, so the house no longer exists. But this becomes a hub of the abolition movement. You have the Anthonys opening up their home on Sundays to host abolition meetings. You have people like Frederick Douglass, his wife Anna Murray Douglass, William Lloyd Garrison, and John Brown that are all visiting this house. And we also know that the Anthonys were starting to think about women's rights as well. Susan B. Anthony is not at the first Women's Rights Convention in Seneca Falls. There's a sketch of Elizabeth Cady Stanton delivering an address there. History really wants to place her there, but she's still teaching out in the Canajoharie area. But her family is engaged in what is happening in this region. And in August, there will be a second Women's Rights Convention that takes place in Rochester. And it's there that Susan B. Anthony's father, Daniel, her mother, Lucy, and her sister, Mary, will all attend, and they will actually sign the Declaration of Sentiments in support of the women's movement. And so Susan B. Anthony will come to Rochester and really settle there in the early 1850s. It's hard to pinpoint exactly what date because she is going back and forth to teach in various areas, but she'll start to get involved in the abolition movement, and the family is also focused on temperance as well. So knowing that we're not too far from Seneca Falls, I'm sure many of you have seen this statue, and this is of Susan B. Anthony being introduced by Amelia Bloomer to Elizabeth Cady Stanton. And Susan's the one in the long skirt. She hasn't adopted that Bloomer style costume yet. She will adopt it, but be one of the first to revert back to the long, heavy skirts after she finds that when she's making a speech in support of the abolition movement or the women's rights movement, that the next day the newspapers aren't talking about what she has to say, but they're talking about what she's wearing. So she'll go back to wearing what society expects of women, and in hopes that they'll focus more on what she has to say and less on her appearance. But Susan's a little late to the game where women's rights are concerned. You've already had that first Women's Rights Convention in 1848. 1851 is the year that she'll meet Elizabeth Cady Stanton. Susan B. Anthony will be 31 years old. Stanton's just a few years older than her. And she is going to start traveling around New York State. And I think that we sometimes forget that women at that time to even stand out and speak in public is not acceptable in society. So these women are really putting a lot on the line to stand up and speak publicly. And so it takes tremendous courage and organization for them to do their work. And so as I mentioned at the beginning, these are the two women that we are going to focus on Susan B. Anthony's relationship with tonight. I think that these are some of the women that set the tone for change in this country. And a lot of the things that Susan B. Anthony, Martha Coffin Wright, Harriet Tubman, Emily Howland, and thousands of other women wanted to see change are things that we're still talking about today. So not too far from where we are is the Cayuga County Courthouse, and there was a convention that took place in Auburn in 1855. Now, before this, Susan B. Anthony is starting to recognize that the women's movement is starting to gain some traction. You have lots of women that are starting to organize, but once they organize, they're not doing anything. And she starts to realize that it's because they don't have access to their own resources. If they are married and they're working, their paychecks under the law belong to their husbands. And so they don't have access to their own money. They can't hire a speaker. They can't rent a lecture hall to gather together. And so she'll make a comment saying every woman deserves a purse of her own. Susan B. Anthony will become famous for carrying an alligator purse, which becomes a symbol for financial independence. But when she makes that quote in 1853, women aren't carrying purses. She's certainly not carrying her alligator bag, because women at that time had nothing to carry. And so you are starting to see in New York State lots of different conventions popping up. And when I'm talking about this, it gets really challenging because you not only have the women's movement, but you have the abolition movement. You still have temperance gatherings, they're all happening at the same time. It's a lot of the same people. So a lot of the time we get asked, well, who was at this convention? And it's like, well, which convention, what year, what location, and what is the topic? And so this one that took place in Auburn in 1855 was for the Women's Rights Convention, and Martha Coffin Wright was actually concerned that there would be poor attendance. She wrote to her sister, Lucretia Mott, there was quite a tolerable audience, and they listened with apparent interest to Banthony's hard facts. So Susan B. Anthony always went by Susan B. Anthony. So she and Martha had a really great relationship, and so to poke fun at her a little bit, she always referred to her as Banthony. So that's not a typo. That is intentional on her part. And she says, and the more polished periods of Mrs. Stanton, I have heard so often that the law classes women with children and idiots and allows 6 spoons and etc. to widows, and that means the man has custody of the wife, and that the men who enforce the laws are mean men, but not meaner than the laws. That it is not quite so fresh as when I first listened to it, but I was glad for it to be driven in and clinched in the Banthony's hammer and anvil style for the benefit of those to whom it was new. So Susan B. Anthony will work, and Martha Coffin Wright somehow ends up presiding over a lot of these meetings in a leadership role, and sometimes is hesitant to take on that role, but ends up doing so anyways. But Susan is starting to interact with Harriet Tubman around this time as well. And her father has gone to Kansas because her brothers have followed John Brown out there. They're a part of Bloody Kansas. They're going to settle there. But Susan is left in charge of the farm. And she didn't have a green thumb. Her sister made a joke about it's a good thing she never had any children based on how she cared for the raspberry bushes that were at their farm. But she is taking care of things at home. And she will write in her diary, superintended the plowing of the orchard, the last load of hay in the barn, all in capital order, fitted out a fugitive slave for Canada with the help of Harriet Tubman. Now, what's inconclusive in this diary entry is Harriet Tubman actually present for this happening? It's certainly the first encounter that we've seen written where she is mentioning Harriet Tubman, and they are going to continue to work together and be aware of one another and supportive of each other's causes. I picked this letter that Susan B. Anthony wrote to Martha Coffin Wright because I think New York State has often gotten a pass for being progressive and having the abolition movement and women's movement so active here. But the work that they're all doing, their lives are on the line. Susan B. Anthony at this point has worked for the American Anti-Slavery Society as an agent. She and Frederick Douglass have traveled around New York State together. She's actually one of the few agents that will complete her year-long loop of New York State. Others had to back out because of how hostile the environments became. So even though they were in New York State, there were a lot of people that were resistant to any type of change. And so it's the first line that really struck me when I stumbled upon this. Dear Mrs. Wright, here we are, Mrs. Stanton Green and I, alive after the Buffalo mob. And so the other thing that I like in here is at the end, she'll say, don't your folks get up a scare about the hall. They have at Utica and Rochester, but we shall go through. And so this was how determined these groups of people were to create any type of change. They knew their lives were on the line, but the work and the cause was too important to back down. Now, Syracuse, New York is not going to be friendly to the abolitionists and the suffragists of the time. It's actually going to be one of the worst communities that they go and visit. Susan B. Anthony and Reverend Samuel J. May were traveling for an abolition convention to Syracuse, and it's there that dummies were made of their persons, and the dummies were made to engage in lewd sexual acts, and then they're burned in effigy. And so Susan is still not deterred even after that experience. And so Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton are going to organize a tour of abolitionist speakers in New York State. Martha Coffin Wright is going to agree to preside over 2 of them in Auburn, one on January 31st in 1861 and then February 1st of the same year. And they'll arrange all the conventions. There are concerns about the earlier conventions that were disrupted by angry mobs, but they're going to proceed anyways. Martha Coffin Wright will write to her daughter Ellen, "This will be my busy week, getting notices for the convention posted, putting one in the dailies, and seeing the mayor to get him to send policemen to the hall and entertaining our guests. Our anti-slavery convention here begins tomorrow afternoon and lasts through Friday afternoon and evening. That is, if it's not broken up by a mob, as it was in Syracuse yesterday. And have been in several other places. I have taken such precautions as I could in arranging for the convention, and then if it is disturbed, the responsibility must rest on our public men who are continually preaching up compromise and concession toward our Southern brethren. We are expecting Reverend Beriah Green, Samuel J. May, Aaron M. Powell, Mrs. Stanton, and Susan B. Anthony tomorrow morning." So the convention does take place, but there was a mob of 150 men that will break up the meeting, and an area newspaper reported, "In the evening, a motley crowd of rowdies and loafers assembled and broke up the meeting, taking possession of the room and organizing a meeting of their own, and passed the same resolutions adopted by the Syracuse mob meeting." So the quote that's up here is Susan B. Anthony's response to said mob. She will say, "Why, boys, you're nothing but a baby mob. You ought to go to Syracuse and learn how to do it." And she will actually help the convention proceed. They're going to finish their convention at the home of David and Martha Coffin Wright. So even though there was a mob, they moved it to a private residence so that they could continue their work. And at this point, you have the Civil War that has taken place, and Susan B. Anthony and many of the women are going to refer to this as the War for Freedom. And during this time, Susan B. Anthony, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, Antoinette Blackwell, Lucy Stone are all going to help found an organization called the Women's National Loyal League. They're going to support an immediate emancipation of all that are enslaved, and they will start sending petitions around, and they collect over 400,000 signatures in support of an immediate end to slavery at this time. So when that 13th Amendment is passed and ratified, women are part of the main reason that that was possible. So Elizabeth Cady Stanton will serve as president, and Martha Coffin Wright, Susan B. Anthony, Lucy Stone, and Antoinette Blackwell are all going to be a part of the organizing and the continued work of the Loyal League. Harriet Tubman, who's pictured up there as well, is busy at that time serving as a nurse and working as a spy for the Union Army. And Susan B. Anthony also was a huge supporter of nursing being a recognized profession, one that welcomed women. 15,000 women will enlist as nurses during the Civil War, and this was a time when anybody could say that they were a nurse. There was no formal training, and the women were not welcomed into this space. They had to really push their way in, and they were subjected to a lot of harassment and cruelty from the male surgeons and doctors. And not only were they expected to do patient care, but take care of the mental and emotional well-being of their patients. They often spent time with their patients, writing letters to home, writing goodbyes, providing comfort for those that may have lost limbs. And then in addition to doing all of that, are expected to do women's roles in the home. So doing the cooking, the cleaning, and all of the wash in addition to all of those things. After the war, you have the 13th Amendment passed and ratified, which essentially abolished slavery in the United States, though there was a lot of work left to do. And the women's movement is now looking at what are our next steps. And Martha Coffin Wright will actually be the person that will read the proclamation to change it from the women's rights associations to the American Equal Rights Association, with a focus on universal suffrage. And so for the first time, you have a unified group of people working towards full enfranchisement of everyone. And unlike the American Anti-Slavery Association, or Society, excuse me, women held leadership roles here. So in the Anti-Slavery Society, they weren't sure if women they were fine with them being agents and being the boots on the ground, but they weren't necessarily sure that they should be in leadership roles. So this organization is a little bit different. And pictured here are some of the members of that movement. So you have Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton. You have a younger Frances Ellen Watkins Harper. Then you have Frederick Douglass, Lucretia Mott, and you also have Sojourner Truth here. So with the American Equal Rights Association, you think that there's a unified body of people, but it gets a little complicated when the Reconstruction Amendments are introduced. The first being the 14th Amendment, which defines citizenship. Citizenship is supposed to protect your rights, liberties, and freedoms, but the problem is the second section includes the word male. So whose liberties, rights, and freedoms is it in fact protecting? And then with the 15th Amendment introduced, which says you cannot be denied the right to vote based on race or previous servitude, Black men would be the only ones that would be enfranchised with the vote. And this causes a lot of division within the American Equal Rights Association. Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton feel betrayed that women have been excluded. They want 2 more words added to that 15th Amendment, and sex, so all women would be included. Stanton will push out petitions to include this, but will say that even Martha Coffin Wright was hesitant to sign this. So if she won't, what good are petitions if women such as Martha Coffin Wright will not sign them? And so during the Civil War, Martha Coffin Wright really focused more on abolition than she did women's rights. And so she's not necessarily sure which side of the argument she's going to land. So there's going to be a series of debates. Susan B. Anthony is going to directly challenge Frederick Douglass as to why women can't be included in the 15th Amendment. And he will basically say, if women are included, it won't pass. We'd be asking for too much. He also addresses the harsh realities of what Black men and Black people are enduring at this time and the violence that they're experiencing daily, and saying it's more urgent for Black men to get the right to vote than it is for women at this time. And he also feels if Black men can get the vote, the 16th Amendment is right behind them. They'll be able to help push that through, and that'll be to get women the right to vote. It's another 50 years before women get the vote after the 15th Amendment is passed and ratified. He did say later on, had he known women wouldn't be right behind, he might have approached that differently. But you're also going to have Frances Ellen Watkins Harper join the debate. She's pictured right here in the corner. And she will speak to a room full of mostly white women. And she'll say, you white women here speak of rights. I speak of wrongs, reminding them that they have largely ignored what Black women have endured. And so you are going to see a split within the movement. And Martha Coffin Wright will write to her husband. She attends one of the debates in January of 1869, and she'll say, we had a spirited debate which gave interest to the convention. Susan told them they were fighting a man of straw, for there should be no antagonism. All we asked was equal suffrage, not that one should precede the other, taking the broadest ground and leaving the politicians to wrangle over expediency. She'll write, Edward insisted, and some of the best friends of Congress agreed with him, that abolitionists were recreant who think anyone at this juncture but Black suffrage. They ignore Black women. I think we hold the right ground, and that justice can be secured only by maintaining it. And so Martha Coffin Wright will end up siding with her close friends Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony in this debate. Ultimately, the American Equal Rights Association isn't going to be able to agree on how to proceed. It was an organization founded based on the grounds of universal suffrage, everybody sticking together and working to get the vote for everybody all at once. And ultimately, they're not going to be able to move forward. The American Equal Rights Association will fall apart, and you'll see the women's movement split. Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton will form the National Woman Suffrage Association. Their focus will be on an amendment granting all women the right to vote. And then you'll have Lucy Stone and Henry Blackwell form the American Women's Suffrage Association, and they'll go state by state to get women the right to vote, but they are going to support the 15th Amendment, and Frederick Douglass is going to join that organization. And so now you have two groups of people that all want the same thing, but they won't work together. And this causes a lot of problems within the movement, and you are going to see a lot of frustration between the groups. Racism and religion certainly plays a role in how they're going to move forward. You won't see any type of unification until 1890, and even then, both organizations are making a number of what they'd consider sacrifices to come together. Susan B. Anthony and other women are not going to give up on the vote for women. They're thinking it's now going to take way too long for women to get the right to vote and to get an amendment, so they're looking for other loopholes. And they're going to revisit that 14th Amendment, which says if you're born in the United States, you're a naturalized citizen. If you're a citizen, it protects your rights, liberties, and freedoms. Shouldn't that include the vote? And so there are legal professionals that say, well, you all need to test this. And so you're going to see women around the country attempt to register to vote in 1872. Susan B. Anthony and 15 other women will head down Main Street in Rochester and not only register to vote, but they will cast votes in a presidential election. And I found this quite funny that David, Martha Coffin Wright's husband, will say, you will see by the papers that Susan B. Anthony and many others have voted in Rochester, but I doubt the truth of the reports. And Susan B. Anthony will actually write to Martha Coffin Wright and say, I never dreamed of U.S. officers prosecuting me for voting, though only that I was refused should I bring action against the inspectors. But Uncle Sam waxes with the holy indignation at such violations of his laws. And so Susan B. Anthony would write to Elizabeth Cady Stanton and say, I've been and gone and done it, positively voted, and I hope you did too. Stanton wouldn't ever vote during her lifetime, but I loved the following excerpt from Martha's diary saying, wrote to Miss Anthony enclosing $5 for lawyers. So she is supportive of that cause. And Susan B. Anthony and the other women were all technically arrested, though she is the only one that will go to trial. And the judge will be from Washington, D.C., and it's Judge Ward Hunt. He'll become a United States Supreme Court justice. He denies her a trial by jury by dismissing the jury and not allowing them to deliberate. He'll also inform them of the verdict, which is guilty, and he'll tell Susan B. Anthony that she's been found guilty for voting as a woman and fine her $100 plus some court fees. And he will give her an opportunity to speak, but continue to interrupt her. But she'll ultimately say at the end, I'll never pay $1 of this unjust penalty, and doesn't. It's still marked unpaid in the courthouse records. And even though she doesn't win her trial, she does get the publicity that they're looking for the women's movement. So this is one of my favorite political cartoons that we share of Susan B. Anthony. It's titled The Woman Who Dared, and it's addressing Susan B. Anthony standing out there in front of all of them with no support. The women in the back corner behind the two men, those are your suffragists. The artist has drawn them to be rather aggressive looking, and they're small in number because the women behind the woman dressed as a police officer are your anti-suffragists. In New York State had a very large contingency of anti-suffragists and women that were working against the women's rights movement. So Martha Coffin Wright passed away before she could see the National American Woman Suffrage Association form, but it's what she hoped for. She wrote a letter to her sister Lucretia at one point talking about how upset she was that there were two women's movements. She said, I guess two is better than nothing, but really felt that a united front would make them strongest. And so by 1890, the National American Woman Suffrage Association was formed. Susan B. Anthony will become president, and in 1895, the headquarters will move to 17 Madison Street. So pictured there is the attic of Susan B. Anthony's home, and in our collection we have letterhead that has National American Women Suffrage Association on it, national headquarters, 17 Madison Street. It's really cool anytime we get to take a look at that. But this was a hub of activity. You have women from around the country that are coming to Rochester to do this work. And Susan B. Anthony at that point is also traveling anywhere from 8,000 to 13,000 miles a year. Even right before her death, when she was 86, she had made a trip to Washington, D.C. before that. So she really doesn't let much deter her. And this is oversimplifying it, but basically Elizabeth Cady Stanton at one point said Susan B. Anthony has no off button. She just keeps going. There are a number of New York State Women's Suffrage Association meetings. Harriet Tubman is a regular attender at those anytime that she could be. And Susan B. Anthony will actually introduce her as a keynote speaker at the convention in Rochester in 1896, but she'll continue to do that. And she also wrote, as Harriet Tubman also mentioned at one point, she belonged to Miss Susan B. Anthony's association. This is an image from a book cover that I found at the Library of Congress. This was one of Susan B. Anthony's books, and it's something that was really touching and moving to me when I found this, because it is 1903, and Elizabeth Cady Stanton had passed away in 1902. Martha Coffin Wright is gone. Many of the pioneers of the women's rights movement are no longer with Susan, and she's visiting Martha Coffin Wright's children here in Auburn, and Harriet Tubman will just happen to stop by. And so to me, this is a really bittersweet moment. It's celebrating this woman that has stopped by, that has these incredible accomplishments, that's continuing the work just like she is, but it's also reflecting on the fact that so many of them that had worked together were no longer here.
Howland.
Yes, Emily Howland. So Susan B. Anthony will pass away in 1906 at 86 years old, and she will make her famous Failure is Impossible speech just before she passed, when she's in Baltimore for the women's suffrage convention there. And at that point, I do think she understood that she wasn't going to live to see women get the right to vote. But she truly believed the younger generation was going to carry the work forward and that it would happen. Though a few days before she passed, she basically says to Reverend Anna Howard Shaw at that point that she fought 60 long, hard years for a little liberty, and to die without it seems so cruel. So I do think that there was disappointment in not seeing as much change in her lifetime. But you are going to have the younger generation carry this forward. Pictured at the top is Ida B. Wells Barnett. She's one of my favorite suffragists. She stayed at the Anthony Museum at least, or at Susan B. Anthony's house at least twice. Right below her is Reverend Anna Howard Shaw, who is a close friend of Susan B. Anthony. She mentored her. She's also partner to Susan B. Anthony's niece, Lucy. And then we also have Hester Jeffrey. Hester Jeffrey is the only woman from Rochester to eulogize Susan B. Anthony. She's also responsible for the first statue of a black man in the United States. That's of Frederick Douglass at Highland Park in Rochester. She did all the fundraising and the organizing for that. And then we also have Mary Church Terrell and then Carrie Chapman Catt. So you have all of these women that are coming together to continue to do the work. And you will see New York State adopt suffrage for women in 1917. Rochester will vote no. So even the home of Susan B. Anthony is not supportive of this. Larger cities were not. Utica and Albany did not pass this measure. And it's really the immigrant population in New York City that will push that through. It's 53% will vote in favor of women getting the right to vote. And even when the 19th Amendment is passed and ratified in 1920, technically on paper it says all women have the right to vote. But that isn't the reality of what was happening in this country. You still have Jim Crow, the Jim Crow South, which has poll taxes, literacy tests, and acts of intimidation to bar Black voters from accessing the polls, and many others. When you include a literacy test there, those that don't have access to education are also denied the right to vote. The Chinese Exclusion Act was put in place in 1882. This denied Chinese immigrants citizenship rights, and this wasn't removed until 1942. And then you do have the Indian Citizenship Act in 1924. Even though this was passed, granting citizenship to the indigenous community, many states made it impossible for them to access the vote, which resulted in the Voting Rights Act of 1965 being necessary, that racial discrimination was not acceptable at the polls. And so even though there was significant change, there was a lot of work left to do. And a lot of the things that they advocated for are topics of discussion now. When we work with our school students, we often use the example of equal pay. It's a lot better than when Susan B. Anthony was teaching, but there's still a ways to go for women.
All right, well, thank you. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, everyone.
Round of applause.